Orleans Humanist Perspective, presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people, living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Humanist Perspective. I'm your host for this evening, Jim Dugan. For more information about the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, please visit www.nosha.info. My guest this evening is Mr. Robert Wilfong. He's been here a number of times already. He's a resident of the city of New Orleans and is quite a history buff. He has a master's degree in that field. And I understand that this evening we're going to talk about something most people have forgotten, the golden age of American free thought. What is that?
That is true. Well, it's a period from 1875 to 1914 when more Americans than ever before or since were interested in the ideas of free thought, agnosticism, atheism, secularism, anti-clericalism. It was quite an amazing age, an age of great optimism, an age of great advances in science. People believed in the progressive nature of science. They were very hopeful about the future. It's no coincidence that the era ends in 1914 with the beginning of the unmitigated disaster of World War I, when suddenly people saw that science could destroy as well as create, that could bring devastation as well as prosperity and progress. Mm-hmm. But during this era, the ideas of secularism were promoted mainly through itinerant orators like Robert Ingersoll, who could travel the United States and speak to crowds of thousands in an era before the microphone. People would pay a significant amount of money at the time, $1, which was probably closer to $50 today, to hear someone mock the religious shibboleths of the time, to put forth a secular perspective.
Now, Robert Ingersoll is, some people still hear of today, some people still read some of his speeches, this well-known anti-clerical, anti-religious speaker of that time. But some of these other people we're going to talk about have pretty much disappeared from American consciousness.
It's strange. Well, perhaps our attention span doesn't allow us to think about people like this anymore. These are people like John William Draper and Andrew Dixon White. Andrew Dixon White is the co-founder of Cornell University. He was a pioneer of secular education. The founding of Cornell was the beginning of the land-grant colleges, which were completely free of religious control. This was an innovation in the second half of the 19th century. He was a diplomat to Russia and Germany. He was ambassador to Germany for a while. He was a minister to Russia, first president of the American Historical Association. He was a heavyweight. John William Draper, born in England, lived in America most of his life. He was a chemist, a doctor, a historian, a pioneering photographer, a very accomplished man. First president of the American Chemical Society, a founder of the New York University School of Medicine. Both of these people wrote major works. Ingersoll was a popularizer. He was something like maybe in our time Carl Sagan, who was very effective at communicating ideas. But Draper and White attempted to make major works detailing the history of what they called the conflict between religion and science. So Draper's work is called The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. Andrew Dixon White's work has the great title. I love this title. They don't make titles like this anymore. The History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. And these were very influential works at the time. Draper's work went through 50 printings and was translated into 10 languages. So it's
so this is just to set the context a little bit. You have this era of American expansion, this Reconstruction after the Civil War, of industrialization, of very rapid expansion in scientific knowledge and engineering applications, and buried in all of that, or mixed in with it, you have this anti-clerical secular movement brewing in Kansas and in Texas, and places, parts of America we wouldn't see that today. I
think Ingersoll. I read that Ingersoll spoke in every state except Mississippi and maybe 2 others. Mm-hmm. And he spoke in a lot of places that we would consider quite conservative today, and was well received, very enthusiastically received. So it's a very interesting time.
So, and the two men that we're focusing on here, White and Draper, really produced a lot of work. White's material, of course, is two big volumes.
An encyclopedia. It's like an encyclopedia of secularism. It's an amazing work. And Draper is he's trying to make a theory of 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years of intellectual history, the intellectual history of the whole Mediterranean world, of the West Asia, North Africa, and Europe, with starting before Christianity, before the Roman Empire, with the conquests of Alexander the Great and the founding of the scientific city of Alexandria, and going through the beginnings of Christianity and its development through and becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. Going on, it's too much to go into, and I was struggling with this, trying to find a way that I could bring this down and give it a concise introduction. I finally gave up. I think it would take another whole episode to do that.
So we have these works that were very scientific in their era. 125 years later, science has progressed far beyond these writers. In some ways, their material is dated, yet you find a great deal that is worth reading and rereading in these.
For secularists, for atheists, for agnostics, I think there's very interesting material. And I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I'd like to go more into that. As preparing for this talk, I realized that there are many contemporary historians of science who reject this conflict thesis. They call it the conflict thesis, the history of the conflict between religion and science. And I'm not sure how I feel about that. I would like to go more into their critique and to respond to that critique. But I have found in both of these works, I found very interesting material, especially of interest to atheists and to agnostics. And perhaps some of the reason that people think that this stuff is dated is because people no longer are interested in the ideas of atheism and agnosticism, and have found some accommodation between religion and science. And I'm not entirely sure is there. There are scientists who still hold the conflict thesis quite strongly.
So what would you tell us about some of the contents of these that are so intriguing?
Well, okay, so there is, first of all, let's see, in Draper's book, his attempt to sum up the themes and issues of more than 2,000 years of history, he was commissioned to write this book in the immediate aftermath of the Vatican Council of 1869 to 1870. We have also forgotten about the Vatican Council, as well as the golden age of American free thought. The Vatican Council was an astoundingly anti-modern, astoundingly reactionary meeting of the Council of the Catholic Church. Its pronouncements are stunning even today. I remember it, in passing, hearing that this was the council that decided on the infallibility of the Pope when in speaking of morals and questions of morals and ethics. But there's so much more to it there. And a popularizer of science in the United States asked Draper to write this in response to the anti-modern stances of the Vatican Council. And again, that's too much to go into, except that I would say that the Vatican Council, as well as talking about the infallibility of the Pope, also affirmed the necessity of Catholics believing in miracles, which if that is the ultimate conflict between religion and science. Also declared themselves, the Catholic Church, to be superior and more important than all other churches, and superior to the state, and said that it was not bound by the laws of the state. And reading that in the light of the clergy child sex abuse cases was quite spooky, and made me realize.
So do you feel that Draper made his point?
Yes,
he succeeded.
Yes, okay, so Draper's conflict thesis, you can sum it up in the preface to his work. He says, "The history of science is not a mere record of isolated discoveries. It is a narrative of the conflict of two contending powers, the expansive force of the human intellect on one side and the compression arising from traditionary faith and human interests on the other." I think that is still the issue that we face today. And I would say it's a conflict between two worldviews, the worldview of the supernatural explanation, assuming that there is a conscious supernatural being creating and directing the affairs of human beings and interested in the behavior of human beings, and the natural view that things happen because of the automatic operation of natural laws. And so in this sense, it seems to me, of course there's a conflict between religion and science.
I would say that in my brief acquaintance with White's book, The History of the Warfare between Science and Theology,
in Christendom.
In Christendom, okay. That and this is a very encyclopedic work, as you've mentioned, but it whittles away at the room for religion to work, that room for mythology, for miracle. It shows how science just steadily over centuries takes a nip out of it here, takes a nip out of it there, narrows it until there's nothing left.
Right. And that's this encyclopedic mass of detail that we have forgotten about is very interesting, very stimulating for atheists and agnostics to read. So I would like to talk about, we can get some idea of White's work through two particular stories. Most of his stories are too long and involved to go into in just a few minutes. He is not a man of few words. He is not a man who is content to give one example when 7 or 8 are available. He's going to give you all 7 or 8. So even in talking about when you start talking about things like the going from the idea of creationism to evolution, we'd be here for days talking about the material he has on that. But two particular examples stand out. One is the reaction to Benjamin Franklin's lightning rod, and the story of the reaction to the introduction to the smallpox vaccination. So on the lightning rod, he starts off and he goes into some detail about in the Middle Ages, people became more and more convinced that storms, the things that we would call today extreme weather events, that these had their origins in devils. This was the work of devils. So he says, during the Middle Ages, this doctrine of the diabolical origin of storms went on gathering strength. Bede had full faith in it and narrates various anecdotes in support of it. St. Thomas Aquinas gave it his sanction, saying in his all-authoritative Summa, "Rains and winds and whatsoever occurs by local impulse alone can be caused by demons. It is," he says, "a dogma of faith that the demons can produce wind, storms, and rains of fire from heaven." Martin Luther, later in the other religious camp as the Protestant, supported the superstition even more zealously, asserting at times his belief that the winds themselves are only good or evil spirits, and declaring that a stone thrown into a certain pond in his native region would cause a dreadful storm because of the devils kept prisoners there. So what do you do if the storms and the lightning are not God's judgment but are caused by devils? Then of course you can defend yourself against that. And how would you do that? People had various remedies. Of course, prayer is always good. And the church developed exorcism rituals and even formulas for priests to go out in the middle of a storm and exorcise the demons who are causing the storm. Religious processions, saints' relics, but the means of baffling the powers of the air, which came to be most widely used, was the ringing of consecrated church bells. Now, this is interesting, since in these days, of course, as Europe is building churches with tall towers and steeples, and these are often struck by lightning. And so you have a metal bell in the middle of a tall tower, and when the thunderstorm approaches, you're telling the bell ringer to go up there and to ring the bell to scare the demons. This could be a life-threatening task. So nothing worked always. All these things had limited value, and storms kept happening, and hailstorms and lightning kept striking churches. And so eventually in the 1500s and 1600s, the church began to think that perhaps the demons were working through human agents. Witches, and perhaps if we could discover the witches and judiciously apply torture, we might be able to find out exactly how they're doing these things and prevent them. So, inspired by the scriptural command, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," Pope Innocent exhorted the clergy of Germany to leave no means untried to detect sorcerers, and especially those who by evil weather destroy vineyards, gardens, meadows, and growing crops. These precepts were based upon various texts of Scripture, especially upon the famous statement in the book of Job, and to carry them out, witch-finding inquisitors were authorized by the Pope to scour Europe, especially Germany, and a manual was prepared for their use, the witch hammer, Malleus Maleficarum. In this manual, which was revered for centuries, both in Catholic and Protestant countries, as almost divinely inspired, the doctrine of satanic agency in atmospheric phenomena was further developed, and various means of detecting and punishing it were dwelt upon. Thousands of women and children, basically it was women and children, were arrested and tortured and stretched on the rack until they confessed of how Satan had used them.
And this is these things you're talking about, this belief that devils, with the assistance of witches especially, could raise storms, send hail, destroy crops, your cow will stop giving milk, your wife won't get pregnant, all of these things. That is right out of the Hammer Against Witches, the Malleus Maleficarum, this medieval manual. And also, you read echoes of it very heavily in Cotton Mather's on witchcraft in Salem, 1692.
Yeah, right. So, but in spite of all this, the lightning kept striking the church towers. And finally, in 1752, Franklin made his experiments with the kite on the banks of the Schuylkill. And at the moment when he drew the lightning from the storm clouds and proved that lightning is something that occurs naturally in thunderstorms, the days of the prince of the power of the air, the days of the theological explanation were numbered. So he develops the lightning rod, and people start to put lightning rods up, and sure enough, it works. You would think that everyone would be, oh, this is wonderful. We've solved the problem, but not entirely. even though the church was finally obliged to confess the supremacy of Franklin's theory, practically, even though they didn't want to. For his lightning rod did what exorcisms and holy water and processions and the Agnus Dei and the ringing of church bells and the rack and the burning of witches had failed to do. And finally they had the answer to the question, why should the Almighty strike his own consecrated temples or suffer Satan to strike them? And even so, there were people who did not accept this. In America, the earthquake of 1755 was widely ascribed, especially in Massachusetts, to Franklin's rod. Where did that power go? It went down the church and right into the ground. There was an earthquake afterwards. The Reverend Thomas Prince, pastor of the Old South Church, published a sermon on the subject, and in the appendix expressed the opinion that the frequency of earthquakes may be due to the erection of iron points invented by the sagacious Mr. Franklin. He goes on to argue that in Boston are more erected than anywhere else in New England, and Boston seems to be more dreadfully shaken. Oh, there is no getting out of the mighty hand of God. But still, it did work. And yet, one of the themes of White's book is it shows you how difficult it is to go from the supernatural worldview to the natural worldview. It's not easy for people. So in England, the first lightning conductor upon a church was not put up until 1762, 10 years after Franklin's discovery. The spire of St. Bride's Church in London was greatly injured by lightning in 1750, and in 1764 a storm so wrecked its masonry that it had to be mainly rebuilt. Yet for years after this, the authorities refused to attach a lightning rod, when it was clear that this would work. The Protestant Cathedral of St. Paul's in London was not protected until 16 years after Franklin's discovery, and the tower of the great Protestant church at Hamburg not until a year later still. As late as 1783, it was declared in Germany on excellent authority that within a space of 33 years, nearly 400 towers had been damaged and 120 bell ringers killed after the discovery of the lightning rod. But the case which did the most to convert the Italian theologians to the scientific view in Europe in general was that of the Church of San Nazaro at Brescia. The Republic of Venice had stored in the vaults of this church over 200,000 pounds of gunpowder. In 1767, 17 years after Franklin's discovery, no rod having been placed upon it, it was struck by lightning. The powder in the vaults was exploded. 1/6 of the entire city destroyed, and over 3,000 lives were lost.
Did they start using lightning rods after that?
After that, they did. Yes, they finally caved in and started using
we have echoes of things like this in modern times. I'm thinking of, there's people who will tell you that HIV is God's will, or vaccinating young people against the human papillomavirus.
Katrina. Katrina
is God's will.
Because it would tolerated homosexuality, therefore God is punishing the city of New Orleans. This worldview, I call it the moral universe. After reading this, gradually you develop this conception of the moral universe, of people believing that things do not happen for natural reasons, but happen for moral reasons, and that all natural phenomena happen by the incessant intervention of supernatural beings making moral judgments upon human behavior. It is very deep-seated and very hard to give up. So the second story here is also applicable to today, the question of vaccination.
Very, very applicable. We only have about 5 minutes, so you'll have to get through it.
I knew this was going to happen. I'll have to come back and do some more. Okay. All right. So the around 1800, Edward Jenner, an English physician, discovers the principle of vaccination against smallpox. Smallpox has been a terrible scourge. And he begins to vaccinate people. There's reaction against him, but he keeps on with doing it. In 1798, an anti-vaccination society was formed by physicians and clergymen who called on the people of Boston to suppress vaccination as bidding defiance to heaven itself, even to the will of God, and declared that the law of God prohibits the practice. And yet they kept on, and once vaccination was taken up, of course, there were There were predictable results. It worked. And eventually people had to take it up. Well, I wanted to read an amazing story from Montreal, but I don't think we'll I would rather do a couple of other things. Okay, so one striking idea of Drapers that I don't have time to go into in great detail, but as I was telling you before, his notion of the Reformation. I was always taught that the Reformation happened in around 1510 in Germany when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the end of the church door. Draper claims that that Reformation is the Second Reformation, the Northern Reformation. He claims that there was almost 1,000 years earlier a First Reformation, the Southern Reformation, and that we refer to the Northern Reformation as Protestantism, but the Southern Reformation we know as Islam. And this is a very, very interesting concept. I'm not sure what I think about it. I want to do more research on this. It is true that there are striking parallels between Protestantism, the theology of Protestantism, and the theology of Islam. And that when the Protestants moved to Unitarianism and then on to prohibitionism, anti-alcohol prohibitionism, they had become almost identical to the Muslims. Okay, so the can't talk much more about the
I think
Vatican Council.
Let's do this in about 2 minutes. What happened? How have we lost contact with these? Or why did they fall out of favor? Or
Well, okay, no, I think that as so often happens in life, someone is a victim of their own success. What science was trying to do in the course of the 19th century was to emancipate itself from the control and influence of religion. They wanted to be free to investigate the natural world without having to worry about what the religious authorities would think. And they achieved this by 1900 or so. And once they did that, science tended to withdraw from the public sphere. It went into the laboratory, went into the university, went into learned societies and scientific institutes. And it no longer spoke to questions of belief and of worldview. It just did its work and occasionally emerged with the announcement of a new discovery. Religion on its side, as I say, was the conflict was that science was saying things that would challenge the authority of religion. By the end of the 19th century, people had three choices. The Bible had been discredited as a serious source of information about the origins of the world. So you could either embrace science and drop the Bible, you could embrace the Bible and drop science, or you could waffle, and you could take up some science and some religion, and you could take this kind of mealy-mouthed cafeteria style that doesn't really think about anything through to the end.
So did we waffle?
I think most of us have waffled. Yes.
Robert Wilfong, I have to say we are just about out of time.
I can see.
And I thank you much for your contributions and your very, very interesting topics. Always, maybe we'll go into some. We could probably just have some of the best stories out of White and Draper at one point here.
We'll have to do some more of this. Okay, very good. Well.